Hi everyone, welcome to Archetypes in the News for April 12th, 2018. It's great to be back here with you again, and I'd like to thank everyone for the comments and questions you've been leaving. I've been really enjoying the discussion in the comments thread, and I'm going to take a suggestion and try and unpack the correlations a little more thoroughly this week. And what a week it is with the FBI raid on Michael Cohen's law offices and hotel room he was staying in and his home, which he is the personal lawyer for Donald Trump. And what's fascinating is that I believe this is the first time that a lawyer for a sitting president has been served with a search warrant. I could be wrong about that, but it's definitely a rare event. And in order to have had this happen, the FBI would have had to present a tremendous amount of evidence to cross the hurdle for getting a search warrant on a lawyer, especially for the sitting president. So my guess is they have a lot of evidence that they presented to the federal prosecutor in New York, and several judges also, I believe, had to sign off on this. So, and the prosecutor is a Trump appointee, and contrary to Trump's suggestion that these are Democrats, they're not. They're mostly Republicans, and some of them were appointed by Donald Trump himself. So we're going to look at Donald Trump's chart and transits, and we'll look at Michael Cohen's chart and transits. We'll also take a look at Richard Nixon and his transits for the impeachment of Watergate scandal, and the similarities to what happened then, and Nixon's chart and transits, and what's happening now in Trump's chart and transits. So really interesting correlations there, and I think they'll be very instructive. Yeah, so let's take a look. Okay, we'll start with a brief review of Donald Trump's natal chart. He's born with the Sun-Uranus conjunction. This is a part of him that's unpredictable and erratic and loves chaos, loves to kind of stir in that. And it's in a trine to Jupiter, which Jupiter is support, good fortune, success. He's had success, good fortune, wealth. And the shadow side of Jupiter is arrogance and hubris and, a sense of entitlement and superiority complex. So this seems to be what's taking place in much of his manifestation. Another thing that's really important in his chart is he's born with Mars rising, and that's the part of him that's very combative, tends to be reactionarily aggressive to almost anyone that he feels is in confrontation with him. And what's happening is Pluto is at the midpoint of Saturn and Mars. So Pluto intensifies the Saturn and Mars and draws all of them together. So it's kind of like a wide triple conjunction, but Pluto intensifies both Saturn and Mars. So you get more of a steely, disciplined nature from Mars and like more of a rigid, judgmental side, and Pluto brings in like the punitive, like the visceral kind of intensity that he tends to attack people with. And the attack obviously is Mars, the aggressive, assertive nature. And so yeah, you get this judgmental quality with Saturn. It's really rigid dimension, and then Pluto just intensifies it, and then Mars is like the assertive warrior. And another really important part of his chart is the fact that he has Mercury square Neptune. And there's a lot of potential positives for any of these combinations. The Mercury-Neptune tends to be a sensitive, intuitive mind who often has like a poetic imagination, and tends to see things in pictures, and is able to make sensitive, or has a sensitivity to one's environment and other people and in communication. And it's interesting. I mean, he does have this certain level of intuition that surrounds his ability politically, his political astuteness, and being able to, intuit what the populace of America is really feeling. But the shadow side of Mercury square Neptune can be difficulty in seeing reality clearly, in the sense of Saturn is consensus reality. It's the way we see, or it's what we agree upon is truth and what we can validate. Whereas Neptune can be true, but real, but it's what you believe is real. It's your imagination. It's the collective imagination, but it's not what we all necessarily agree upon as being the reality. And so with Mercury Neptune, in his case, he tends to fall into the shadow side of this and has like slightly delusional thinking and tends to believe his own imagination in spite of the facts that are presented to him. So I see this part of him as a big part of the pathological lying nature of who he is, and the real difficulty he has with sticking to the truth in the collective sense of what the general masses believe. So that's just a highlight of his natal chart, and then we'll take a look at just recently, on March 22nd, he was informed that he is a subject of the investigation. He was informed that he's not a target, but that he is a subject. And from what I can gather, it's at this point that his tweets have really taken on a more combative tone. This is when he first named Mueller by name in a tweet. And what's happening here is Saturn obviously is opposing his natal Mercury. It's exact, and Saturn is the law, it's constriction, it's consensus reality, and so he's being held to account by the consensus reality, by the law, and it's putting a lot of pressure, constrictive pressure, on his mind and the way he thinks. And then with Mars coming in, it's more aggression, more combativeness, more attacking, like attacking Mueller, blah, blah, blah. So he's really being triggered now by the circumstances of an enclosing investigation, which corresponds to Saturn, and it's holding to account his inability to stick to the truth, the integrity of his Mercury, how much integrity is his statements, is his mind, his speech, all Mercury things. And what's fascinating, if we look at the current transits this is for the raid that took place, the FBI raid, Mercury is in a retrograde period right now, and it's forming a grand cross with his natal Mercury and Saturn and Mars in the sky and Neptune. So this would be a big grand cross if it doesn't draw it on the chart, this is the way it's set up, but this would be a giant cross here between Mercury, Saturn and Mars and Neptune, which makes the grand cross is the most challenging set of aspects you can get, basically. And what's interesting is you get the constriction Saturn on his Mercury, but then Mars is there too still, and this kind of he's claimed he's going to attack Syria now. He's finally called out Vladimir Putin by name, which I give him credit for. It's way too late, but he finally did that, and he's taking on more of a combative tone in all of his rhetoric, and he's, from what I understand, he's extremely frustrated, off the hook. We've thought he's been off the hook for a while, but from what people are saying, he's really, really frustrated at this point. And it's really interesting too, because he can't find a lawyer to defend himself. That's also part of this Saturn Mercury alignment. The inability, Saturn difficulty in finding a lawyer, Saturn, to defend Saturn, himself, his mind, and the way he thinks, his statements. So really interesting there. And then also the non-disclosure agreements that are a big part of this. That is also a Saturn Mercury issue. I'll actually go ahead, and you can see this is Stormy Daniels' chart, and she's born with Mercury at 8 degrees Aries, which is fascinating because Saturn is exactly square her Mercury as well. This is for the airing of the 60 Minutes interview. And what you see often with Mercury Saturn, other than the things I just described, is the consequences of one's decisions, or what one says, Mercury, hold more weight, have more consequences. That's Saturn. When whatever one says during Mercury Saturn events, they tend to have more karmic weight, gravitas, dimension, and longevity. They tend to last. Those decisions tend to last longer. And so really fascinating that, this is one of probably the most karmically important decisions she's made in her life, in a sense, as far as politically. And for her to speak out at this time, and the consequences of what she is saying obviously have had tremendous ramifications. And so, yeah, I just felt like that was a really interesting connection, on top of the fact that Donald Trump has very similar alignments. So yeah, deeply intriguing. One other thing I can say is that the day on March 9th of 2017, when Trump fired Comey, Mercury in the sky was right here. It was square to his natal Saturn. So he had Mercury square Saturn when he fired James Comey. Again, a decision that had tremendous ramifications, the consequences of the special prosecutor, actually. So really, really interesting connections with all of those alignments. I think one thing I should say, like, I feel like Donald Trump, because he hasn't had like a self-reflective process in his life, I'm guessing, but it's because he hasn't looked at himself a lot, and now he's propelled himself to the highest position in the world. Now he's projecting his shadow, because he hasn't looked at himself, onto the whole world, and he's having to see it for the first time in a real significant way, because everyone is mirroring it back to him. So I think this is what we're seeing. We're seeing him go through a psychological meltdown because he hasn't done the self-reflective work that's necessary for psychological astuteness, for a mature psychological awareness. And, again, ultimately, I think this is what astrology can help us do, is to see ourselves and see our archetypal complexes and how they're manifesting in time, rather than being an unconscious puppet of them the way Trump seems to be at this moment. So now we'll take a look at Michael Cohen's chart. Michael Cohen is born with the Jupiter-Mars conjunction, and it makes sense for he's like the fixer in the sense he takes action to support Donald Trump, and that's what he's been labeled as. And we'll see. He's also known as a pit bull, so his Mars is like he's an attacker. He likes to threaten people with lawsuits, blah, blah, blah. So a lot of things there that are interesting. But even more interesting is the fact that his moon, this is a noon chart, so it could be 7 degrees on either side. It could be as far as 9 degrees Capricorn or as far back as 25 degrees Sagittarius. But either way, Saturn is close to it on the moon, which fits like the law coming in to one's home, invasion of personal privacy, the moon, and confiscating legal documents, Saturn. And Mars is there as well, so even more of the like penetrating, aggressive assault from the FBI in this case. And I'd also like to point out that Saturn is in a square to his natal Saturn, so it's a karmic quadrature alignment. Like Saturn is the maturation cycle. It has to do with our maturity and how our service in the world, our work, our career, that type of thing. And Saturn, it's gone around once and 3/4, so he's at his Saturn square Saturn. So it's the consequences of one's work, karmic actions being met with consensus reality and how we've been showing up. So an accounting of how one has been working with Saturn with integrity or not integrity. So we'll see if he has got a lot of secrets buried or not. But so finally, we'll take a look at Richard Nixon's chart and his transits for the Watergate scandal. So Nixon is born with a Mercury-Jupiter-Mars triple conjunction that's opposite Pluto. And you can see this in him as kind of the ambition, Jupiter-Pluto, the desire for power, Pluto. Jupiter expands that, so kind of the worldly breadth of ambition. And then with Mercury-Pluto, you get like potential for manipulative thought processes or compulsive thinking, paranoid thinking. He's very paranoid. And it's also, obsessive, compulsive, like he was obsessed with things. And it also corresponds to control and power, domination and manipulation. So that's more of his Mercury versus Trump's with Neptune. It's just kind of all over the place. But what's really, really fascinating is that on the night of the Saturday Night Massacre, well, during that time period in general, we were going through a Saturn square Pluto period, which we're actually now in a Saturn conjunct Pluto period. So they correspond to crises in the world, politics and wars and that type of thing. But this is obviously a serious crisis. But look at where Saturn is. It's conjoining its Pluto, but it's opposite his natal Mercury, just like Trump has at this moment. And the consequences of this decision were tremendous. This is what led to the impeachment trial, or ultimately his resignation. So really fascinating combination. We have the Saturn-Pluto and the Saturn opposite Mercury, and then he actually resigned a year later when Saturn came on to oppose his natal sun. So really, really interesting combination of correlations there, and really interesting decisions that Donald Trump has in front of him, with Mercury in the retrograde period, square Saturn, square his natal Mercury. The decisions he makes in the next 2 or 3 weeks are going to be have a lot of karmic weight to them. So that's what I'm seeing this week at this moment. It could change tomorrow, and hopefully I'll be able to do this again, but I actually am going to have to devote a lot of time to my presentation for the United Astrology Congress in Chicago and on Memorial Day weekend. So I might not be able to do this for a little bit, but I'll try, and it's been great talking to you, and I hope this has been helpful. And please leave any comments or questions you have, and I'll hopefully address them and incorporate them for the next video. So I hope everyone's doing well, and we'll talk again soon. Okay, take care.